I was working as a chaplain at a hospital. My patient visit was not off to a good start. From his hospital bed, Jim looked at me angrily and said, "If you have nothing to offer but repeating back what I'm saying and your uninspired platitudes, leave me alone and get out." Jim, not his real name, was in his 50s, a devoted husband, a loving dad, a proud and hardworking actuary. He was also dying of cancer. After he screamed those words, I stood frozen. My feet felt like 300-pound weights were gluing them to the floor. You see, ever since I attended nursery school at Beth Chaim here some 30 years ago, I've been a bit of a rule follower, so I'm not used to anyone screaming at me. We were both silent. His words played out as if on bullhorns in my head. "Leave me alone and get out." In that moment, I closed my eyes, truly not a clue what to say to him, terrified to open my mouth, lest I say something to make Jim feel worse. Maybe the most respectful thing I could do was to honor his demand and leave the room. I was afraid he was right, that I had nothing to offer, that I didn't have what it took to help him. I felt the heaviness of my feet on the ground. My lips were quivering in fear, hidden thankfully, behind my N95. I knew that no one would have held it against me for walking out of the room, for apologizing to Jim for bothering him, for not being able to cure him. But part of me felt that leaving would have been giving up on him. Then, in the heavy silence between us, a small voice whispered inside of me, "You have the strength to be here with him." Viktor Frankl wrote, "Between stimulus and response, there's a space. And in that space is our power to choose our response. In our response lies our freedom." Between stimulus and response is our freedom. Our freedom to choose how we act is the very thing that makes us human. Frankl, psychiatrist, writer, and Holocaust survivor, wrote about this in the weightiest of contexts humans can imagine, surrounded by the suffering and horrors of the Holocaust. Even in the years he spent in concentration camps, Frankl believed it was possible to find freedom through his response to unthinkable circumstances. In the hospital room, this idea, though not the circumstances, were playing out. The silence after Jim yelled created a space for me to listen and choose my response. I chose to stay in the room, to face the immense fear I felt and summon all of the wisdom and love I could muster to stumble through being with Jim. Stimulus and response often happen so close together that we don't notice the space between them. A partner says something that irks you and you snap at them before thinking. A colleague makes a comment and you immediately voice agreement before determining what you believe. A child tantrums at bedtime and you lose your temper. Stimulus and response happen continuously throughout our day, so it's almost impossible to find that space and freedom to intentionally choose our responses each time. In choosing whether to leave the hospital room or stay with Jim, I do not believe that either choice would have been fundamentally wrong or a transgression to atone for. It's Yom Kippur, and yet this story is not actually about atonement. It's a story about our choices. So what's the connection to this day? In addition to atonement for past transgressions, I believe Yom Kippur is about our choices. It's about imagining better versions of ourselves in the year to come, versions of ourselves who resolve not to repeat our mistakes. When we are faced with the same situation in the year to come, a situation where we once acted badly, we can choose a different response. Yom Kippur helps us imagine the versions of ourselves who pause, if for mere seconds, to listen to our inner voice and to be intentional about how we act. Finding our freedom in the best versions of our own responses is precisely what Yom Kippur demands of us. In one of our central prayers of the season, the Unatan Tokef, we chant the words, on Rosh Hashanah it is written, and on Yom Kippur it is sealed, who shall live and who shall die. We find a few other important words in this prayer that we don't always recite in the English. In Hebrew they are, Kol Damama Daka Yishama, a still small voice will be heard. I believe many of us experience this small voice of God as the voice of our conscience, the voice that calls out to guide us towards ethical and good decisions. The words that immediately precede Kol Dmama Daka in the prayer are Uveshofar Gadol Yitaka, and the great shofar blasts. Like much of this prayer, we have a contrast between two poles, the piercing sound of the shofar and that quiet, inaudible whisper of our conscience. Perhaps the contrast between the volume of the shofar and the silence created after the blast is needed to draw our attention to our quiet inner voice. Much like the silence created after Jim's yelling drew my attention inward. In this prayer, we often focus on the who shall live part of the text. Some of us studied it together on the second day of Rosh Hashanah. I'd like to suggest that the most important part could be that Kol Dmama Daka. Through the noise of our lives, never-ending stimuli, whatever comprises your daily hustle and bustle, when we notice the space where this hustle and bustle pauses, we begin to make it possible to hear the Kol Dmama Daka. I stayed in the room with Jim. I called out to God, and voices shaking, we cried, and we prayed across different religions for him to experience God's grace. We prayed for his family. The words that comprised my response were surely imperfect, but I knew that in that space, that silence after his anger, I listened and made a choice. With my freedom, I chose to stay in the room. What could your year to come look like if you embrace your freedom to choose? Over the next hours of Yom Kippur, may we begin to find that space between stimulus and response, to hear the Kol Dmama Daka, and make choices that embody the best versions of ourselves. Gamar Chatima Tova, may we be sealed for good in the book of life.